Hello and welcome to the Trapital Podcast. I'm your host, Dan Runcie. Our guest today is Cherie Hu, who is the creator and owner of Water and Music, a newsletter, podcast, and membership site that is dedicated to unpacking big ideas and trends in music and technology. She's also a freelance journalist. Cherie, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
For those of you that read Trapital this past week, saw that we did a newsletter takeover. And it's funny because back in December, I think it was either November or December, Cherie had emailed me and she was like, hey, what do you think of this? We should do this. We should do a newsletter takeover. And then I paused and said, what's a newsletter takeover? And she broke it down, and it was good for a number of reasons. One, just from an independent publisher perspective, I think it does make sense for people like her and I to be able to collaborate on stuff like this. This idea of fantasy and how it's picked up in sports and how it translates to music and whether or not that could pick up was definitely something that was in the back of my mind. When you brought up the idea, I was like, hey, that's great. Let's do it. I'm sure we got some thoughts on it.
Yeah, I think my stance was actually slightly more skeptical than I actually ended up being. I could break it down into two sections. One, so unlike yourself, I haven't really done like a fantasy sports experience personally, but I know some people who have. And the one like major distinction to me is the concept of the event of a game. And I didn't really see, for some reason, I didn't really see the equivalent of an event like that in the music world. And in doing more research for this article, I realized that like maybe the closest thing would be a festival where you have multiple artists performing. But even then, it's not an event where you really have two parties competing against each other, or that's not really the point of the event. And then two, and this ended up being a pretty substantial section of my piece, is this concept of competition in the first place in the music industry. I feel like people in music are already having their heads spinning around artist competition on like the Billboard charts, on streaming playlists. Like there are already so many other sources of kind of like stressing out and freaking out around data that I don't know if like how much, if anything, the fantasy label experience would add to that, or would it improve that? Would it maybe help that out a little bit? I was really skeptical about that. And then just how like fans interact with music as an art form and like music culture. I feel like the value that they get is not necessarily from pure numbers driven competition among artists. If anything, music culture thrives the most when it's more collaborative and when a lot of artists are winning at the same time, which obviously is not the case in sports.
Yeah, that last point was something you emphasized strongly in your piece. Sports and the success of what is seen in sports is more directly correlated to the success of what someone would have in fantasy, right? Your best wide receivers are most likely to be the people that score the most points in fantasy football. That isn't always the case, but more often than not, it is. But in music, it's so different because, like you said, it isn't an event. So there isn't like a set point where people were competing. And this is something that I had struggled with as I was trying to think about how this could be feasible on a mainstream adoption perspective. So that was one of the things. But yeah, just a bit more on that point. I mean, we can go across genres, whether it's hip hop or outside of hip hop. The artist that would be the most prolific from a points accumulation perspective, however you want to measure that, whether that's commercial success, tickets, streaming, etc., it wouldn't necessarily correlate to who are considered to be the best or the most talented. And I think some of that makes that narrative a bit tougher.
Yes. And yeah, this is another thing that I talked about too, and kind of was at the root of my initial skepticism too, is like defining success. So not, not even just commodifying or like fully datafying artists in general, but also just defining what success is. And that's something that I found, interestingly, like a lot of apps in this space did have to think about, like, what are we measuring? How much flexibility do we give? And there were, I think FanLabel, when I talked to the founder of that app, he said that in the future, they want it to be like totally open. So, fans or maybe even artists could host their own contests, or labels more appropriately could host their own contests, and kind of set their own metrics in terms of what they're measuring, and like how artists and the fantasy rosters that they're on can kind of climb up the ladder. Because as you'll see in a lot of like music industry reports, especially the ones that have come out recently, like the top streaming artists will be totally different from the top radio artists, like terrestrial radio, meaning who'll be very different from the top like artists by follower growth on Instagram or Twitter or whatever. So there's just a lot of different ways to measure success, which in the grand scheme of the music industry is amazing. And that kind of like collapses. There's a danger of that collapsing in a fantasy environment where everyone competing, at least in the same competition, is kind of subject to that.
What do you think about Billboard has made several attempts to try to put all of these different things on an even playing field, right? Whether it is a physical download or a digital download or a stream, whether it's on YouTube or on a paid service. I think that's the closest thing that music could ever get, but even that in itself is imperfect. It would just emphasize the wrong things if people try to focus on that as the metric of success.
Yes, and artists can very easily game that system, whereas it's just a totally different game, quote unquote, of like an artist trying to get to the top of the Billboard charts versus like a sports team trying to win against another sports team. Just like the strategy is just like totally different. And I would argue in sports, I don't know if this is true, but I would argue in sports that because you have another like team against you, it's so much more complicated than just a formula. Obviously you have to take into account, how different teams or like different teams, coaches, et cetera, play, what all different players' stats and what the other team is like. Whereas on the Billboard charts, it's just a formula. If you get the highest album equivalents or whatever, this would be for like the album chart. If you get the highest number of album equivalents based on this formula, then you will win, quote unquote. Then you will be at the top, and that's just much more easily gamed. And you're seeing everyone ranging from Justin Bieber, who like posted these screenshots asking fans to stream his music overnight on Instagram. He's like not the first one. You're seeing like fans kind of coordinate to do the same thing for a lot of K-pop acts, a lot of Asian acts too. So it's just a totally different dynamic. And when artists do game that system, I would say most people are not happy, or most fans kind of see through that and they see that as like not being authentic, not being really true to why music as an art form exists in the first place. And so, yeah, even that chart, which is hypothetically very comprehensive, already gets a lot of backlash.
Right. Because I think the big difference between the two with sports versus fantasy, specifically not sports versus fantasy, but sports versus music as it relates to fantasy, is the fact that the fans are removed from the sport experience. Right?
Exactly.
And I think we both talked about this. If I go buy a LeBron James jersey, or if I go buy a Russell Wilson jersey, I don't have any impact on what actually happens on Sunday, right?
Yes.
But if I go and stream Selena Gomez's song because she tells me she wants to go number one, as she shamelessly did, as Justin Bieber did the week before, then that's going to help them, right? So I do think that changes the dynamic quite a bit. I think what makes fantasy football and all these other sports interesting is that fans don't truly have any agency in the outcome beyond their desire and their passion and what have you. But in music, you do. So when you think about all of the corruption or issues corruption might be a strong word, manipulation more so, that already exists in sports to some extent because of fantasy, it would be compounded even more in the music industry now. The only things that fans have no say in are the subjective things like the awards, and that's a whole nother mess to work through.
Right. Okay, two things. One, funny you mentioned like a sports fan buying a sports jersey and that not really impacting the charts, because there's this whole merch bundle thing going on that actually, I guess, compelled Billboard to slightly change their rules around specifically what kind of merch transactions will be counted in the charts, but like that's a perfect example of something that would not have any impact in sports actually having very tangible impact on the music side, at least. Look at like the top 10 Billboard charts to the point where you have like these huge stars like DJ Khaled like complaining about it. So so there's that. And then what was I going to say? Oh, okay. One comment that the FanLabel CEO made that I found very interesting, and I'm still trying to figure out if I actually agree with it. So whether fans could have, the potential to really influence the outcome of these like fantasy label experiences just by nature of consuming the product at hand. Part of his response was like, oh, we don't actually want this to be data driven, and we want we don't want this to be serious. We want it to be like a lighthearted competition where mainstream consumers, like they don't have to be super fans, can just like be on the app, put on their favorite artists, and just like see what happens. And that actually contrasted with someone else I interviewed, or I think most people I've talked with just about this concept in general, even outside of this article, who claim that fantasy label experiences are really for super fans, and they're really for this very small niche audience of general music fans, I guess, who are really passionate about like digging through and discovering like new artists, or like figure out which artists are really going to break, and kind of like studying that on a really microscopic, granular level. Like that's super niche. I just thought that was an interesting comment because I really don't think the fantasy label experience, based on just like music fandom in general, is a lighthearted thing. I think it ended up being a very like serious and like as we've been talking about, its most extreme and like a very involved experience on the part of the fan.
Yeah, I would hearing that comment from you said it was the CEO, right?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
I would disagree. Yeah, I'm going to push back on that because I think that what makes fantasy football specifically more than any of the other sports as popular as it is because it's able to attract both the hardcore super fans and the casual fans. And when I think about the things that have taken off in media over the past few years, especially the games, they offer that same type of optionality, right? Like if you want to play Fortnite and just do your own thing and roam around, you can do that. If you want to get involved with all of the tasks and things that you have to do and go hardcore about it and try to compete against the top people, you can do that too. And I think fantasy in that same way, at least the way it's set up from the head-to-head matchups and all that, you can do all your research, run your regressions, and optimize your lineup to have the perfect team. And more likely than not, I think you will be rewarded for that effort. Or if you just want to put in, your minimal effort, make sure your lineup's active, you can at least have a chance. And I think that's what makes it interesting. But the thing is, that doesn't necessarily exist in music in the same way, because I think football benefits from the fact that it's the most watched thing week in, week out at that event aspect. And because music doesn't have that, it's not to the same aspect.
Yes. Yes.
I feel like the closest thing I could think about is like, let's say a big album drops, right? Like we all know that Drake's album is about to drop, or Travis Scott's going to drop Astroworld. Super fans are going to be at the computer at midnight, Thursday night, Friday morning, expecting it to drop and listening to it and talking about how it's a classic after listening to 2 tracks and all the other stuff that goes on, right?
Right.
Like that's very much ingrained, but that's still such a small subset of people that live on Twitter and hip hop heads, Reddit threads doing those things. And if you're on those threads at midnight on a Thursday, you're not a casual listener. You are a super fan. That is literally the definition. And those are the people that are going to be in tuned enough to participate in something like this on a regular basis.
Yeah. Yeah. That's such a good point. Yeah. Going back to the event element, like the equivalent would maybe be these artists dropping a single every week or something, which some artists will do leading up to an album release, but then kind of what happens after that. And then you see with all of these album drops that, at least at the mainstream level, so with album drops or even with like single drops, it kind of like spikes super quickly and then kind of like goes down just as quickly. And So yeah, that would be really interesting as like a fantasy label app trying to figure out how to account for that. Like, is like, how does that then factor into like labels that have that artist when that single comes out? Does it mean that that artist is like really kind of in demand one week, but then like the streams are down to not 200%. The streams are down like by more than 50%. So it's like not in demand anymore. Like, are you really gonna like seriously treat it like actually like a stock movement? Because in that case, then yeah, it's really hard to translate that to music in a world where, at least in the recorded music side, these releases aren't as common.
Right. Like, hearing you break that down, it makes me think a lot about Travis Scott, and I think we'll talk about him in a little bit because he was involved in the that meme that I posted in my article about how would you spend your $15. But I forget what song or when it was. You know the song "Highest in the Room" that he dropped like a couple months ago?
Yes.
So the song debuted at #1, and as someone that follows this industry and listens to this stuff, I literally saw it and I was like, wait, which song? And then I had to think. I was like, oh, that's the one that he did the merch drop for like Thursday or Wednesday or whenever it was. And now it's the #1 song on Monday. So, you know, it's completely understanding how the system works. And yeah, he got the #1 song in the country, but it feels different than, I guess, most of the other songs that were the #1 song in the country at some point. Like, by the time like Lizzo Truth Hurts became #1, I knew what it was, right? By the time that Old Town Road was #1, I knew what it was. But
interesting.
What's his name? Travis Scott just being able to be like, nope, I dropped the single because everyone bought my t-shirts or the whatever collab it was. And those are the kind of people that, not people, but those are the kind of artists that succeed in that type of way. And in some ways, it does remind me a little bit of I don't want to call it arbitrage because that's probably giving it too favorable of a word, but identifying the gap between the people that are great at putting up stats in sports versus those that are considered great. And this might be a little bit of a nuance, but I remember playing fantasy and my friends and I would often talk about, okay, these are the best running backs or these are the best wide receivers on the table. And you would literally think to yourself, okay, if this player is on too good of a team, then they might stop playing as hard in the fourth quarter. They might put their reserves in. And if they put their reserves in, that means it might be less stats for your star player. So if you want to win, is it best to have the best guy equivalent that's going to be on a team that ends up barely making the playoffs because they're fighting every game versus the team that's going to be coasting because they've already won it out by the holidays. So that's something that reminded me of that to that same extent, but still it's nowhere near, I feel like, that difference that we see in music where it can be such a wide gap between who's considered great versus who can just put up numbers.
Yeah. And this, I guess, now goes to the question of like what I discovered in my research. This other music and tech journalist named Stuart Dredge pointed me to this app called Fantasy Music Manager, which is based in Norway. And right now, they're working with this Norwegian music competition, which is like the local feeder competition for the Eurovision Song Contest, which is pan-European. And in doing more research into that app, I realized that is actually probably the closest thing in music or in musical entertainment to a fantasy football or fantasy sports like experience, because it is a competition. There is elimination every week or whenever the episode airs, and there is a very clear winner. The only thing though is that those shows, like that is also a limited amount of time. So from the app's perspective, kind of like once that competition is done, they kind of have to like go on to the next thing. And there aren't that many voice competitions, I don't think, that are going on at any given time during the year, let alone ones that would want to partake in a fantasy experience. But I just realized that was a good example of of like a musical experience that'll be analogous to fantasy sports, but it should be said, is also declining in popularity, I think, anyway. Like, if you think about in the U.S., American Idol like kind of relaunched, but I don't really know who's watching it. The Voice is more popular because of the judges than because of the contestants. That's kind of my stance. And probably if you see like what people are talking about online, it's probably the case. And it's in part because people aren't going to these competitions to figure out who's like the next big artist anymore. Like they're going to, they're listening to whatever they want to listen to, or they're going to these streaming services like Spotify or Apple Music, which have a very robust kind of curation system to kind of seed either very established artists or kind of the next big artists editorially and algorithmically. And so I think people have kind of shifted away. It depends on the market, but I think in the aggregate, people have shifted away from these kinds of competitions and determining which artists they should be paying attention to anyway. But yeah, I thought that was an interesting finding because it if anything, it made the argument for the fantasy label or fantasy like music contest concept, but in a time where people don't really watch those kinds of shows anyway.
Yeah, you had mentioned that point in your article too, and I agreed with it. I think that there's things that are good about that concept, but I think there's challenges too. The good thing is that, yes, it is very much a set time frame and it's intended to be a competition. And I know that there's been brackets and votes and similarly for whether it's Idol or The Voice or even outside of music, things like The Bachelor and all that stuff.
Yes, right.
I think
right.
the sneaky thing about shows like The Voice is that I remember I was writing an article some point last year, and the stats and viewership for that show was surprisingly high, like higher than I would have thought. Like The Voice got more views than The Bachelor, and that isn't something that I necessarily thought would have been the case because I think The Bachelor is an extremely popular show and probably isn't going to be going anywhere. But The Voice is there. With that said, I think you're right in that people want to see, Alicia Keys and Adam Levine more so than the actual competitors themselves. So that's one aspect. But I think the other thing that's a little bit more difficult too is that I'm not sure if those shows are necessarily representative of the quote unquote population. So it could be a fantasy.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah. It could be a fantasy thing like for those people. But I think even just the fact that like you and I are like, oh, like this show's popular, but how many people watch it? It's good. There's like a certain subset of folks that do, but I don't necessarily know how reflective that audience is and of people in general, because I do think one of the things that has made other fantasy leagues or other things interesting is that there's usually enough data or something there that comes in from an attraction perspective, whether it's to advertisers or some other way to be able to monetize the product. And I think that gets
you're talking about like audience data.
Yeah,
or
audience data specifically.
Voting data. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Whereas, with so this could change if shows like Rhythm and Flow on Netflix kind of grow and encourage more shows like that. But for the most part, no rappers on these shows, all singers, very pop, very country, folk driven. So yeah, by nature, you're only focusing on a small audience of people who watch TV or watch these videos on YouTube. That's possible too, but only with a certain handful of genres.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm assuming, did you watch Rhythm and Flow?
I actually have not seen like the last couple episodes, and I really should.
Okay.
I feel like enough has been written that like I know who the winner is, but I saw the first couple of rounds.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure you get the concept by now, but yeah, I think one of the things that's interesting with that is that this is solely up to the voters' discretion. Right. So in many ways, the fans are not involved at all. So that does bring a little bit of that fantasy sports dynamic that's
also very true.
That isn't there with American Idol, which becomes a fan voting competition towards the end.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah. One of the other questions that I had for you was I didn't send it over, but I included in my article a meme specifically about how would you spend your $15? Even though I was skeptical about the idea, seeing the popularity and the virality of those types of memes and questions did often make me think, okay, maybe there's an opportunity for this, right? Because whether it was that meme or something similar, people would post it in my group chats. People would post it on Twitter, and it would dominate the discussion for the day about whether or not you would take this team or who you would take over that person. That shows that there's something there. With that said, does that mean there's something beyond that? Because I think some things can just live as quick memes that people talk about on Twitter, and it is what it is, versus other things can actually be developed into products that can be monetized in that way. So I'm curious if you had any thoughts on that.
On kind of the viability of these kinds of memes to translate into actual products or like things that can be monetized?
Yeah.
Is that the question?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, okay, my answer to that question is partially baked into my answer to the memes question, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No,
or so. Okay. So I think I'll say my answer for now, which like maybe will change by the end of this. We'll see. But so if I had $15 to start a record label based on this diagram, I would choose for now J. Cole.
Oh wait, before you go through, let me describe the diagram for people so they know.
Okay, yes.
So there's 5 tiers for this diagram. You have $15 to start a record label. There are 3 artists at the $5 tier, 3 artists at the $4 tier, $3, $2, $1, and so on. So you could spend your $15 as you choose. If you go linearly, you can spend it on $1, $5, $4, $3, and so on, but you can mix things up. So with the $5 tier, it's J. Cole, Kendrick Lamar, Kanye West. At the $4 tier, it's Travis Scott, Joey Badass, and Drake. Why those artists are at the $4 tier, I have no idea.
Drake, seriously, that's a hot take.
Drake should be at the $6 tier, but that's another story for another day. At the $3 tier, we have A$AP Rocky, Chance the Rapper, and Tyler, the Creator. $2 tier, Earl Sweatshirt, Childish Gambino, and Jid. And at the $1 tier is Isaiah Rashad, Denzel Curry, and Pusha T.
Okay, so I'll answer the question very quickly, and I think in my like thought process around this, well, kind of my like opinion on whether this can be actually productized will come out. Okay, so my label for now is J. Cole and Kendrick, who are both on the $5 tier, Tyler the Creator on the $3 tier, and Childish Gambino on the $2 tier. And this also maybe is not the best label in terms of revenue. If I were trying to optimize my revenue, for sure I'll be choosing Drake. Kanye's kind of like maybe like problematic in the music industry right now, but for sure would choose Kanye because people will listen to his stuff no matter what happens, really, at least at this moment. And so those picks that I chose were, I guess, maybe a reflection of my my personal taste in terms of like what I'm listening to right now. I feel like also with I feel like a lot could happen with this label, but I feel like with J. Cole and Tyler the Creator and Gambino in particular, they're all very I guess diversified artists, if that makes sense. Well, Gambino especially, because like music is just one part of what he does. He also is like super involved in the film world and the film and acting, and he's like a very multi-hyphenate entertainer. And then, I guess J. Cole and Tyler the Creator as well, I guess both have histories as part of these crews, or J. Cole now has Dreamville. I don't know how that would factor into answering this question, but I feel like they have like really not just tight-knit artist networks, but also networks of fans who are fans of that network. So I feel like that will have like a really positive influence on this label. And then I've just been I'm like a huge fan of Kendrick. I think To Pimp a Butterfly was one of the best albums of like the past decade for sure, or like definitely like a game-changing album. So just personally, I'm very interested in what he's doing for rap and hip hop as a whole. And so my decision making here is like definitely more cultural, or whatever analysis I'm doing is more like culturally leaning rather than purely like analytics leaning. And the reason why I say that like my answer to or the reason why I say my picks for my label kind of point to my opinion on whether this can be productized is precisely because of that debate. And like that debate will always be there. And I guess you could make a product out of this, but I don't really see what it would really add aside from maybe having an award for artists who appeared on the most labels, but then so what is kind of the question I would ask. Like it would be a fun, like gimmicky kind of app to put together in this specific context, but I'm not sure if it's something that fans would actually want to maintain over a longer period of time. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
Yeah.
One, I love the breakdown. I love the separation of the two thoughts with it, because I do think with something like this, the thought is that, okay, you have your $15, I have my $15, and let's see that based on however they measure these metrics, who ends up with the most quote unquote points or quote unquote money after a year-long period or after a 6-month period. So that part of it's interesting, but hearing you break it down in that type of way, it does make me reflect on what I would have picked, or not what I would pick, but how I went about mine. And I'll be the first to say I went about mine a bit more shamelessly from okay, let me put my mind like I am the GM for the Houston Rockets and I'm just trying to play analytics. How can I get as many points on the board if my goal of starting a record label is to make money? And I know that not every label there, like Dreamville, definitely that is not their focus MO, but with me, if I'm trying to make the money, let me grab $4 Drake, because that's clearly a bargain. It should be more. I'm going to grab $4 Travis Scott. I will take Tyler, the Creator, for $3, Childish Gambino for $2, and Pusha T for $1. And with that, that leaves that extra $1 over. So I can either pocket that or hold on to it, or if I have to spend it, I'd probably spend it on Denzel Curry for the potential upside there. But I think the real argument became, okay, why wouldn't I take Kendrick when I took Travis Scott and an extra $1 instead? And the thought there is, it kind of goes back to the discussion, right? If I'm trying to build this label that I think has the best opportunity to be historically renowned and made some of the best music that gets remembered for decades, it's Kendrick. But I would have to look at the numbers myself. But I mean, it's hard to compete with the type of money that Travis Scott's able to pull and the way that he's able to just play the game, do his merch bundles, use his albums, leverage his fame in every way possible to make as much money. And that's just something that Kendrick doesn't do as much. The guy barely uses Instagram. I mean, I'm pretty sure that half of the people on this list have more Instagram followers than Kendrick. And that's not a knock at him. That's just more so what he's doing. But it's all goes into, where do I see the money being there? And of course, I think Drake speaks for himself. Outside of, a Post Malone or an Ariana Grande, he's right up there as being he was the most streamed artist of the decade. Tyler, the Creator, if I could spend $3 for someone that can sell out Madison Square Garden, I'm going to take that artist. Childish Gambino, he pulled in like the biggest crowd that Outside Lands, that's a music festival out here in San Francisco, has seen. And Pusha T, from the name recognition at $1, and just having him and Drake as enemies on the same team is just entertaining to me. So I want to make that happen.
Yeah. Okay. Speaking of Gambino and Outside Lands, I think the question would be, or I feel like the task at hand would be a lot more different if we weren't just talking about the label side. Like if we were saying we can. How do you just want to articulate this? Okay, so you could build a portfolio of artists where you have you're investing in and have an upside in their entire business. So not just the label side, but also the touring side. Maybe this will be hard to put together as a product because a lot of this isn't publicly available. But like if they have a huge like brand sponsorship or endorsement, for instance, you would take part in that money. Who would you pick? I feel like looking at artists in that like multi-dimensional way, which I think is closer to the reality of how these artists make money and just operate day to day anyway, would yield very different results. Because I mean, one bigger conversation that happens a lot in the music industry at large is that you'll have artists who like don't stream very well, but regularly sell out shows internationally. And then the other way around is like kind of more shocking to people, where you have artists who have like tens, hundreds of millions of streams, but aren't really selling out their shows that much. Okay, as an example, Chance just canceled his tour, right? For his latest album. There's a lot of speculation on why that happened. And so in that situation, maybe he wouldn't even be on the $3 tier per se. And he also maybe doesn't have as truly global or international of a reach as maybe some of the other rappers on here. I'll have to look into that. But so I think it would obviously make the game a lot more complicated, but maybe like more realistic to how artists actually operate in terms of not just looking at the label, but also looking at their other revenue streams too.
So the game then becomes, who could you sign to a 360 deal?
Yeah, that's true. which might not roll very well with some people. Yeah.
Well, it's funny, right? Because it's one of these things where that's what it would be labeled. Would people care that it's obviously removed in that way, that this is a fantasy game, but just the connotation of how the definition of, not the definition, but how people feel about these deals has evolved over time.
Yes.
Yeah. But I mean, in many ways, that's essentially what it is. But with that said, I don't know. I do think that there is something for the simplicity of these things too. And as much as, people that are really into this, like not even, I think people even beyond you or me from like a research or writing perspective, but the people that really research this stuff, it's there. But it all goes back to the super fan dynamic. Like, what are you trying to build? Like, what is your goal? And do you understand who that person is and how big that market is?
Yeah, and I think this also introduces an important aspect of scarcity maybe to the recording process. Because I think what's happened, not the recording process, the process of discovering music on the recording side. Like, say on a streaming service, you get your Spotify year-end Wrapped campaign. I think I, quote unquote, discovered over 1,000 artists this year, but I cannot name the vast majority of them. I'd probably be lucky if I was able to write down over 100 of them by name, of artists I discovered. And so they're in a streaming environment, it's the opposite of scarcity. These services definitely want to communicate the fact that they have, tens of millions of tracks and a ton of artists on their platform for you to discover. And so your commitment to one artist versus the other, I think, will naturally go down over time as you use the platform more. Whereas here, it's even imaginary concrete money, a concrete number of artists. It yields a lot more interesting insights where you have to actually make a choice about, whose music you pay for or who you would invest in, which was, not that long ago how we would consume and buy music, I guess pre-internet, pre-Napster, all that stuff.
True. It's like who you listen to is no longer just a sense of enjoyment. It's tied into this game, which in many ways is what happened with fantasy football, but that is a good problem that the league and everyone else leaned into, but that would definitely be challenged with the music industry.
Yeah. For sure.
So last question for you on this before we wrap things up. One of the things I had talked about in my article was the fact of having a pure play or a standalone app that does this versus looking at what's happened in sports and seeing that these are not standalone apps that people are using. They are tied into larger media entities, both ESPN and Yahoo being the two giants in this place, and knowing that data that they're capturing and everything else is then either used to be able to upsell or present other types of products or use it to inform certain things. And at least when I was writing my article, it reminded me of how other companies use different business units to subsidize one versus the other. And what could that look like in music? Because I think that's one of the challenges, and that's why we don't even see standalone fantasy football leagues or companies doing things in that same type of way, because at least my take is that I think that these things needs to be combined, or it's at its strongest if there's some other entity to lean on, no different than in Apple Music or in Amazon Music or something like that?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I'm glad you wrote about that in your piece. I think another thing I learned in writing my piece that I thought was fascinating is that Next Big Sound actually started out as a fantasy label. So for those who don't know, Next Big Sound is, I think, like, was really a pioneer in bringing in predictive analytics for the music industry into the mainstream, especially. And so they would their core product now. So Pandora bought them around 5 years ago, but their core product was kind of ranking all artists across multiple streaming platforms, including but not limited to Pandora, Spotify, YouTube, SoundCloud, etc., on like how much they were going to blow up, and kind of making predictions about that. And I think they had like a decent track record around that, probably why Pandora wanted to buy them. But they first started out as a fantasy label, and they focused on emerging artists. They allowed users to create, I think they only had 10 slots. So you had 10 slots to quote unquote sign any number of emerging or unsigned artists. And then you would hypothetically earn points over time. But I think they only got like 2,000 users or so over the course of 4 months. And so it didn't take off that much. And so they very quickly pivoted into this B2B data analytics offering. But I thought that pivot was very illuminating because it kind of revealed to me how maybe the two are not that far away from each other. Like the offering that Next Big Sound offers now in terms of tracking consumption where it's already happening, and tracking these maybe like micro communities of influence where they're already thriving and taking place, and aggregating them and ranking artists in that way. Maybe is if the goal is to service artists and labels and to give them some kind of market research, that might actually be better than just telling fans to put together a limited roster of 10 artists, or it might be more accurate in terms of reflecting actual popularity. So yeah, that's one thing. And then very quickly, the second thing, so FanLabel, I think they see what they're building as definitely more of like a fan engagement play as well. So they actually have limited contests that are limited time. That's kind of like how they put an end to their contests. And then I think if you earn the most virtual royalties, is what they call points from your roster, you can exchange that for merch. And so they have like an active marketplace already on their app where you can purchase, I think it's mostly like major label artist merch. They must be working with directly with management or with labels on that. But they're so it is already slightly diversified in that sense, or like the play there is giving better superfan data, which is kind of ironic because I guess the CEO claims that they're not just for superfans, but getting better superfan data over to the artists and labels and kind of strengthening that relationship. So
yeah, that makes sense. Hearing the FanLabel aspect, especially when you're trying to serve and sell insights, I do think that there's a non-superfan aspect that is engaging there, because if you're able to get meaningful insights and data, people will appreciate if it's both not only the superfans, but it's the casual folks as well, because in many ways we know that casual listeners and being able to drive them is where so much of the money is made. So
that's true.
But yeah, I feel like overall for me, one, I haven't played fantasy anything in years just because I've been burnt out and lost money, but also won money. And I just felt like there's better ways to spend time. But in the meantime, I'll appreciate these memes as they come around my timeline and share them with friends and other people. And now I'll share them with you as well to get your take, because these are the kind of conversations that are fun, but where do these conversations, or where does the opportunity go beyond this? We'll see, but it sounds like we're both skeptical. To wrap things up, I believe this is now the second podcast we've done together, me doing the one that you had back in March. This is your first time now being on the Trapital Podcast. Is there anything that you would like to plug or let our audience know about?
Yes. Let's see. Okay. I guess there'll be two things. So one, thank you for mentioning that podcast that we did. I guess it was a while ago now, but lots of fun. I have a couple more episodes coming out for the next couple of weeks for that podcast. So you can find that. It's called the Water and Music Podcast as well. There's a link on my website, cheriehu.com, CherieHu.com, or you can go to waterandmusic.transistor.fm. So I use Transistor as the hosting site. You can find all the episodes there. You can also find, of course, you can also find the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Pocket Casts, Overcast, Stitcher, all the main podcast apps. And then, if not already, it would be great if you could follow my newsletter and subscribe. It's also called the Water and Music Newsletter. If you just search it on Google, it should come up in the first couple of results. If not, bit.ly/waterandmusic, bit.ly/waterandmusic, all spelled out, all lowercase, and that should bring you there.
Great. And I will include those links in the show notes for this podcast as well, so it can be easy for people to get them. But Cherie, this was fun. I'm glad that you made the time. I'm glad that we did research on this. And for anyone that is interested even more and hasn't read our articles yet, please encourage you to go to the trapital.co website, and you can read Cherie's article that she did with her research on this topic. And when you're done with that, you can go over and head to Water and Music, and you can check out the article that I did on hers, and make sure you sign up for her newsletter.
Yes, please do that. And this is a ton of fun. Thanks again for having me.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please go tell at least one friend about this podcast. Word of mouth is still the best way to grow. If you use Apple Podcasts, please go rate and review. That helps continues to boost Trapital Podcast in the rankings. And also, please go to the trapital.co website. That's trapital.co. There's a ton of great content there. So please check out the articles, sign up for the newsletter, and I'll see y'all next time.